Christian who prays every day. This after recent polls show a growing number of Americans think, wrongly in fact, that President Obama is a Muslim. You see him occasionally at church, at public events, but he doesn't usually go to regular Sunday services. Instead, the White House says he takes part in private prayer sessions with several different pastors. Joel Hunter is an evangelical pastor and part of a small circle of spiritual advisors who frequently talk to the president over the phone. And he was made available to the Washington Post, and he said that's the downside of not wanting to expose what is personal to the political arena. The pastor added it leaves all kinds of room for speculation and conspiracy and people who are just not informed. You know what happens with a vacuum, he says. It gets filled, and he thinks the president should consider ways to convey the depth of his faith to those who want to hear it and see it from him. So does President Obama need to reach out more to the Christian community? Mark Thiessen was a chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush. Simon Rosenberg was an advisor to President Clinton. We're glad you're both here. And Simon, let me start with you. Do you think that the president needs to be seen more often going to church on Sundays, for example?
I would say two things. First of all, it's ironic that, during the campaign in 2008, the president was criticized for the views of his Christian pastor in the church that he attended, right? So we actually went through a period of incredible speculation and interest in the actual church that he went to every Sunday back in Chicago. So this was something that was widely discussed and debated. And I think part of the issue with the poll data on this is that, there is about 45% of the country that is adamantly opposed to the president and the Democrats, 20% that's really opposed, and I think that they want to believe the worst about President Obama. I mean, to me, 80% of the country knows that he's a Christian, and I don't think this is something that the White House has to get all riled up about. I mean, I think they can keep doing what they're doing and rolling out the pastors that he did the other day. He'll be seen, I'm sure, a few times in the next few months going to church. But I don't think this is I think this is more of a molehill than a mountain.
Mark, it's interesting because I guess ever since President Kennedy, who was the first Catholic to hold the presidency, sort of religion and presidents has really been something that people have talked about and wondered about and focused on. And some presidents have been seen going to church on a regular basis. I remember seeing your former boss, George W. Bush, on his way with his family on Sundays. Even President Clinton walking into church services on Sundays. But one president who really sort of did something similar was President Reagan, similar to President Obama, in that he really didn't wear his religion on his sleeve. And I don't really remember anybody giving Ronald Reagan a hard time for that. So what's the big fuss when it comes to President Obama? If he wants to be religious and to worship in private, so what?
Oh, I don't think there's any big fuss about it. I think look, there are lots of polls that show that small percentages of American people hold unusual views. There was a Pew poll last December, that found that 19% of Democrats believe in the evil eye can be used to put a curse on somebody. So there are more people who there are more liberals who believe in the evil eye than there are Americans who believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim. But I think the White House should be concerned about this poll, but not for the reason they are. The problem is another way of reading this poll is that people look at Obama after more than a year in office and say, this guy doesn't believe what I believe. They look at his economic policy, his foreign policy, his health care policy, and all these policies, and they say, this guy doesn't share my values. And I think that's a much deeper problem from the president than whether people think he's a Muslim or not.
Simon, what about that? Because there are also polls that show that there are more Americans who believe that that President Obama wasn't born in the United States, when in fact the Republican governor of Hawaii says that state records show that he was, but there are still people who don't believe it. Why the distrust when it comes to this president?
And more people who believe in UFOs, right, than either one of those things. I think it gets back to what I said earlier. I mean, there is 45% of the country voted against President Obama in 2008, despite and even though he got 53% of the vote, which was the largest margin a Democrat had gotten in 44 years. When you're president, there is a strong opposition to you during the entire presidency. And in this case, I think there's about 15 to 20% of the country that are very strongly aligned against the president. I don't think there's been any tremendous erosion about people believing in his values and all the things that was said by Mark
a minute
ago. You can't overstate a 20% number, right, and sort of turn it into some kind of huge issue, as you were saying yourself, Mark, because we know there's 15 to 20% of the country that is adamantly opposed to the Democratic Party and everything that Barack Obama is going to do, no matter what happens during his presidency. So what's important to me is that 80% actually understand this correctly, which is really what the White House should be focused on.
Mark, last word. Go ahead. I'll give it to you.
What he needs to be worried about, there's a new Democracy Corps poll that just came out that shows 6 in 10 Americans believe that he is too liberal and a big spender, and 55% of Americans think he's a socialist. If I was Barack Obama, I'd be a lot more worried that more than half the country thinks I'm a socialist and that 18% of the country thinks I'm a Muslim.
We've got to leave it there. Mark Thiessen, Simon Rosenberg. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks.
All right.